I'm absolutely delighted to be here speaking with Biospherian Dr. Mark Nelson, who is the founding director of the Institute of Ecotechnics, ecological engineer, author, and one of the key characters in acclaimed Sundance documentary Spaceship Earth. Spaceship Earth tells the story of the scientists and engineers who entered Biosphere II in 1991 and their successes and challenges associated with this human experiment. Before we get to the interview, let's sit back, relax, and watch the trailer for Spaceship Earth.
As I look at Biosphere II and I'm ready to enter, I take my last breaths of this atmosphere for 2 years.
We were pioneers. We were the first biospherians.
How can you prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown?
A biosphere is a closed system with plants and animals and the atmospheres all inside. We called it Biosphere II because Biosphere I is the Earth.
If we're going to go to Mars and the Moon, we better know how to make a biosphere.
Climate change is a threat. We were trying to counteract that threat.
We put in a rainforest, a desert, and a living coral reef.
It was a global curiosity. 8 people separated from life.
It was science fiction without the fiction.
I'm wondering how long they can last in there without getting sick or something.
The oxygen was really getting low. We were suffocating and starving.
We had to make some pretty hard decisions.
To live in a small world changes who you are.
Suddenly you're rethinking what's possible on Earth.
This is an incredible moment. The future is here.
Mark, it's wonderful to be speaking with you again. And from all the BlueTech research team, we would like to say a massive congratulations on the documentary. It was shot beautifully and really captured a lot of the elements about your experience that I wasn't aware of before. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Great pleasure to be with you and also with the BlueTech Forum digitally, virtually.
Thank you, Mark. So we met in Copenhagen at a workshop over a year ago. So hence I'm delighted to be able to speak to you again about the Biosphere II. And I remember at that time trying to visualize this alternative universe that you had lived in during that period of your life. It must bring back a lot of funny memories, but I'm wondering, and I'm kind of curious, what's it like for you to see that all come to life with the documentary?
Well, we went up to Sundance to the premiere and then saw another showing. And I guess I was on the edge of my seat, enthralled and also amazed because they had combed through the archives of the Institute of Ecotechnics, found 600 hours of footage. So I saw a lot of footage that I didn't even remember had ever been shot. So it was kind of a journey of discovery as well.
Wow, it must have been very nostalgic.
Yeah, the Biospherian team 2 years ago had a reunion. It was on the anniversary of 25 years after coming out of Biosphere II. But this, what I love about this movie, it's going to reach perhaps tens or hundreds of millions of people who don't know the story.
Absolutely. And we have some B-roll footage from inside the biosphere for anyone that's curious after hearing about this alternative universe. And for people who haven't seen the documentary yet and don't know the backstory, I've always been curious as to why you, as a young person, because you were quite young when you entered Biosphere II, why you decided to give your life away for science for 2 years. I mean, it's the ultimate sacrifice, really.
What I gained was way more than what I sacrificed, I have to say. And it started for me. I was a director of the Institute. We did projects around the world to prepare for Biosphere II in a way. And I had an experience in the Biosphere II test module that really showed to me the power of being in a small living world. And it changed my perspective or deepened it or very profoundly shifted my thinking about my relationship with the world of life from my head, from my intellect to my body. And after that moment, I joined the Biospherian candidates, and I was lucky enough to be chosen to be part of the first crew.
Wow, it's such a fascinating thing even to speak about. So I can't imagine what experiencing it must have been like. But I'd love to talk to you a little bit today about life inside the biosphere And I know that you have a particular interest in natural wastewater treatment systems, and that you experimented with natural forms of wetland treatment systems in the biosphere. Can you talk to us a little bit about, the diversity in freshwater systems that you were working with inside the biosphere, and also what you learned about natural wastewater treatment systems while you were in there?
The Biosphere II system was quite complex because not only did we have 5 mini biomes ranging from tropical rainforest to fog desert, from Everglades, freshwater marsh, mangroves, a living coral reef, but we had many subsystems within each one of those biomes. We had waterfalls and ponds and recirculating streams. And then, of course, we had our farm. And in all of the biosphere, to have a closed system, you have to succeed at recycling all that water. So it
Mhm.
was a real dance and technological and engineering challenge to get the right water at the right quality back to the biomes at the quantity needed. And
Yeah, I
so
can
the
only imagine.
constructed wetlands, I mean, I loved it. I was the sewage manager of Biosphere 2. But the sewage system was this lovely green constructed wetland. We'd worked with a scientist, Bill Wolverton, a pioneer in the field of constructed wetlands. So I fell
Mhm.
in love with those constructed wetlands, and I love the way visitors to the biosphere, their mouths fell open agape when they realized that that beautiful system with butterflies and ladybugs and frogs and me cutting forage for our animals, that was our sewage treatment and recycling system.
Yeah, it's crazy because people don't associate wastewater treatment with something that looks so beautiful, really, do they? And for me,
To
your
say the
experience
least.
and the diverse water systems that you were dealing with inside of the biosphere really emphasize that our planet is all one interconnected biosphere. So whether it's a virus like COVID-19, or if it's carbon dioxide, or if it's water, everything comes together and everything's interconnected. So, what was the role of natural water treatment systems, and what excited you about the learnings that you could get from working with natural water treatment systems inside the biosphere?
Well, the constructed wetlands in the biosphere were crucial in making sure that we return the nutrients to the farm soil. And, one of the consequences of being in a closed system is that, you can't go, order in a load of compost or manure or get a bag of fertilizer. And we were under the constraints that everything in that farm needed to be beyond organic. We couldn't even use some of the sprays that you might do in organic farming. So the
Fertilizers, I
constructed
can imagine.
wetland, it returned all the nutrients from our domestic animals and from the waste of them and from everything that the humans produce, both in our living quarters and in our laboratories. All those nutrients went back to the soil.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Again, it just emphasizes that closed loop approach and closed loop system. But you've since replicated and worked on some natural treatment systems in both Iraq and Australia. Can you tell us more specifically about those projects, how they're similar and how they differ depending on the environments that they're placed in?
Yeah, what I love about wastewater gardens and why I was inspired to get a PhD in ecological engineering is that it connects people at a very local level to what's usually a mystery is where is
Mhm.
my water coming from that comes into the house, and where does that wastewater go? By making a small constructed wetland that could be sized for a cluster of houses, a business, a hotel that can be sized up for communities and small towns, suddenly that connection is made, and people marvel at, well, I've just used the lavatory, I've just taken a shower, I've just done some laundry, and I go out and here are these beaming plants that are flourishing because the nutrients that are ordinarily a problem that pollute drinking water around the world has suddenly been put to constructive use by those beautiful plants. So in Australia, we did a number of projects on Aboriginal communities, and they typically are very remote. And anything that's very high tech and dependent on electricity and sophisticated technical supervision and management is not going to last. So if you set up a system where nature is doing the work, it's very reliable. So I like to say wastewater gardens basically run on the nutrients that our waste contribute. Gravity, I try to do systems without pumps or very minimal use of them, and sunshine. So in tropical areas, you can do these systems anywhere in the world, and they're being done in Europe, etc. But in warmer areas, a smaller system will do the job, and the diversity of plants that we've experimented with is quite vast. So on these Aboriginal communities, we said, well, what would you like to see in your backyard in your constructed wetland? And they immediately said, we want flowers, we want beautiful plants, and we want fruit trees that we can pick the fruit.
So they're not only providing that service, but they're also adding to the ecological diversity within the area.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a problem in Australian Aboriginal communities. There's a lot of dust. So the more that you can vegetate and green the community. So very early in my thinking, because in Biosphere II, we took the treated water and went back to our farm irrigation, and the nutrients were used. In these systems, a lot of constructed wetland engineers just stop at the treatment wetland. But my philosophy is that it's all valuable, all that fresh water, all those nutrients. So we make a leach drain or a final disposal into another green area. And then you can use trees and shrubs that wouldn't live in a wetland. So you can continue greening the community.
I suppose at BlueTech, we see natural treatment systems being used quite widely for wastewater treatment with corporates like IKEA and Mars. So these groups have been experimenting with the technology. And we also see technology groups like Organica. Where do you see the future of natural treatment systems going? I know in a lot of the examples you have mentioned, it's more on the side of low tech, low income, potentially in areas where there's a lack of sewage treatment, and that's where it's being implemented the most. But in the future, where do you see this going?
Well, I see it really expanding, and as you know, and your audience knows all too well, we're facing a number of crises: climate change, obviously, degradation and loss of biodiversity in wilderness areas. But the water crisis is only accelerating in developed and developing countries. So a big motivation, I think, for natural systems and any way of recycling, treating, and reusing water is that you're saving water resources. And that became a highly important motivation. We did a project in Algeria, and you don't want to be creating your greenery with potable water because potable water is very scarce. So I hadn't really considered that when I got into the field of natural systems and constructed
Mhm.
wetlands, but the water conservation, and of course it's kind of crazy. Among the crazy things we do is that we use potable water fit for drinking, which has no nutrient value for the
Yeah,
plants. We use that as a main irrigation source. So
yeah.
there's something very elegant, and it could be a very powerful driver because the reality is that there are billions of people whose health are suffering and the environment is getting polluted because we need inexpensive and affordable and long lasting solutions. I am very much a believer that there are many solutions. You know, one shoe doesn't fit all cases, but I think the future
Mhm.
of constructed wetlands and natural systems, composting toilets, and for cities where space is limited, there will need to be another range of application. But when I was studying and doing my PhD in Florida, there are two over 400 hectare, over 1,000 acre constructed wetlands that are recreation areas in the area of Orlando. And I love the technology because people go there and they just think it's a very beautiful landscape. And they don't realize that it's sewage treatment. And in one case, it's also recharging the aquifer with very clean water.
So, Mark, you wrote a book called The Wastewater Gardener, and I know our audience is very focused on wastewater and water. So, if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, it was basically kind of a memoir of my work with human wastewater sewage around the planet. And, I'm the kind of guy who finding out what people do with their shit is so interesting. It's probably the one thing that people lie about more than their sex lives. So the book is probably the funniest book you'll read ever in your life about shit recycling.
It sounds like one not to be missed. I really felt like I had a greater understanding of how difficult it was to maintain life within the biosphere after watching the documentary. I know that you did mention that the agricultural space you farmed was one of the most efficient in the world, but what were some of the greatest challenges and greatest successes associated with the Biosphere II experiment?
Oh my goodness. The thing is that we learned a lot from the surprises, from what, screwed up and what was unexpected. For
Yeah.
example, at the biomic level, there were predictions that we couldn't keep it, under one roof, basically, with the same air and water circulating, that we couldn't keep distinct biomes, that it would all become one urban weed infested, or whatever the invasive plants would be from one system would invade another. We had very distinct biomes, and even kept a coral reef pretty healthy, which was astounding at about a
That's very
1,000-meter elevation, a long way from the tropics. So there were a lot of successes, and there was a great, wonderful surprise because we built Biosphere 2 to learn what we don't know. The farming
exactly.
was
So
always a big challenge, and feeding 8 people a diverse diet, including small amounts of milk, eggs, and meat, very small amounts, was always a challenge.
yeah, I can only imagine. And one particular aspect that's mentioned in the documentary and highlighted a little bit is an increase in a specific gas in the atmosphere of the biosphere. I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the documentary yet, but it just came across very clearly to me in the documentary that, for the biospherians, for you guys who experience that, you must have such a greater understanding of the human health associated effects of climate change, because your bodies, the space around you was consistently interacting with the environment that you were in. And that was emphasized because of how small the environment was.
Yeah, I think there's a huge legacy. I mean, I love the film, but you can only do so much in 2 hours. So we could have had
Exactly.
more on the science, which is really exciting. The new experimental biospheric science that we hope to initiate. But there was also a lot of lessons about the human interaction and responsibility. And I think people who say we need to be stewards of the biosphere are kind of overstating it. I think the main thing that people need to be stewards of is ourselves. We are the disturbing element in the biosphere. So, as
Yeah.
you mentioned, I think Biosphere 2 is probably a few decades ahead of its time, but now the world has caught up. So, car- I think we can talk about it. Carbon dioxide was probably our greatest fear when we went in. Could we manage it? Would it
Mhm.
basically get to levels that were really unhealthy for humans as well as the other life forms in there? And I think what we learned is that we need to be participants. In a closed system, you really realize that plants are your other lung, your third lung, and you manage the biosphere. So we were actually atmospheric managers of a small world. And I think because of the power of humans, our numbers and technology, we have to assume that role. And the world is waking up. It's never too late, but it's late.
Yeah, unfortunately. And when people think of climate and climate change specifically, they often think about the atmosphere. And that's what you just mentioned there, the rising levels of CO2 and the distress that that can cause to human health in such a closed environment. But I often wonder, how can we bring the topic of water to the front and center stage when we're addressing climate? Because you would have seen directly some of the impacts on the water system through managing it directly in Biosphere 2.
Yeah, well, we were talking about it before. I mean, the water shortages that are happening everywhere. I mean, California, there's a looming battle between water use in cities and water use on farms. And I think adoption, we'll get to, I hope, redesigning the technosphere, which I think was one of the really great accomplishments of Biosphere II. But I think we're at this point, and the pandemic is a wonderful, I mean, I think the world has given us a little feedback. It's hit the pause button, uh, giving us some time to think. Let's think, when we reopen, do we want to go back to business as usual? I mean, on so many levels, there is waste of water. And I think reinventing agriculture and ranching, building soils, if you build organic soils, you need much less water, and the salinity problems, which are kind of up there with just outright shortage of water, uh, becomes treatable, becomes a whole different ballgame. So I think climate and water are very, very much intertwined.
Absolutely. And our audience today is a group of scientists and engineers for the most part, not to generalize, but that concept of redesigning the technosphere, what exactly do you mean by this, and how can water professionals take a lead on this?
Well, let me just back up. You mentioned, I mean, the interesting thing that challenged us was, if Biosphere 2 is going to be materially sealed, i.e., hardly 1% of atmosphere of air exchanged with the outside per month. Remarkable. That made it a materially closed system that recycles and has to recycle to keep all of the nutrients available. I didn't learn until after Biosphere 2 that the Earth is a closed system. It's just that the buffers, the atmosphere, the ocean, our soil reservoirs are much larger and cycles take longer. But once you really grapple with that, then you got to you have to design your technology to where it's compatible with the world of life. So even before the drama of the 2-year closure and the longer term purpose of Biosphere 2, we had the drama of teaching engineers ecology and getting ecologists to be able to translate their visions to engineers. And what was discovered quite rapidly was, just like engineers on a spacecraft think very carefully and do measurements of the outgassing, of the unintended consequences of any materials or instruments or machines that are put in a spacecraft, we had to do the same thing with Biosphere 2. We had to say to the engineers, that's a really nice solution, but what are the outgassing? Will this harm life? And so the redesign of the technosphere, and I think this is what the technosphere should do on planet Earth. It should support life, and it should be screened so that it's not producing compounds that contaminate water, contaminate soil, pollute the air. So that was
So
the
within
redesign of Biosphere 2's technosphere.
Yeah, so then within environmental design processes, there should almost be an ecological checklist before you even go to piloting a technology, is essentially what you're saying.
Our engineers were pretty unhappy, but when they finally really understood that their engineering was in the context of creating this beautiful, diverse, amazingly verdant world, they got it. And I think that, engineers and ecologists should work together far more often. I think there should be an ecological literacy, both for the general public, but certainly for engineers and technologists, because the reality is that every technological device or process that gets implemented is being affects the earth because it's a closed system. And I think
It,
that's the challenge, and that's the opportunity of the 21st century.
it's interesting because as you speak a little bit about this, it makes me think back, as I'm an environmental scientist, it makes me think back on if we're doing things in the wrong order, because oftentimes you hear of environmental impact assessment after something has been constructed or within the processes. So everything has already been, given the green light to go ahead. And then afterwards we think about the environmental or ecological impacts of what that would be. So it's interesting if you enable engineers and ask engineers to have that ecological understanding before they go ahead with developing something or developing an idea, whether it's a technology or anything else, will that prevent the kind of the line and the barrier between kind of the environment and either construction or development of technology and infrastructure?
Yeah, I think it's and true revolutions begin with change of thinking, and the change of thinking that you're describing is so necessary. And I think it's also fulfilling. This reminds me of one of the other major human lessons of having the rare privilege of living inside a mini biosphere is that the illusion that the environment is outside you is absolutely dispelled. And that was, of course, what happened within seconds, within minutes of my going into that small test module. But equally profoundly, for 2 years, the biospherians were, absolutely understood with every cell in our body that our health depended on the health of this world. And that's the reality which we're seeing now. I mean, there's stories about deforestation contributing to pandemics. There are consequences to the abuse of the environment. And the environment even is a really bad word because it sort of implies that here's humans and here's all of the things that we do, and the environment is something outside of us. No, we're in metabolic connection with the biosphere. This is who we are. This is what we are. This is why we are alive.
Absolutely. And as you say, there are definitely some parallels between what we're going through now as a world, like social isolation, and what you biospherians went through during the experiment. And I remember speaking to you in Copenhagen, we were having dinner and we were talking about the Biosphere II. And I remember saying to you at the time, oh my gosh, how difficult I would find it to live inside a biosphere and not be able to meet my friends or see my family or, do many different social things for 2 years. And now we're in a situation, like you said, in the middle of a pandemic where, people have been forced to kind of take their life maybe back a step, to be a little bit more calm. People are getting a little bit more familiar with their home environment, the ecosphere in which they live, their surroundings. So I wonder, first of all, has your experience in the biosphere for 2 years enabled you to be a little bit more, bulletproof when it comes to a pandemic? Do you find the idea of being stuck at home a little better than the rest of us? You're a little bit more capable. And I also wonder if you think this will change people's attitudes to the environment that they live in and make them think a little bit more about that.
I certainly hope so. And one hears that sales of vegetables and houseplants are soaring, because, that's how you start falling in love with the biosphere. Just like we love our pets, love a houseplant. So I think we should reimagine, and I'm a New York City kid by background. We should reimagine our cities as well. And even before the pandemic, there was this wonderful move to green our cities. And it's part of the solution of cities drive the biosphere. So old-fashioned ecologists who think that ecology begins out there in the country are really missing the boat. This is a reality of 21st century humanity. Half of us live in cities, but those cities, maybe we should not have cars just do what they want. Invest in public transport, get people healthier by biking to work or walking.
Absolutely. And I hope and I wonder if, there will be an increase in blue-green infrastructure after all of this is ended.
Yeah, I hear that New York and I think London and some other cities, in fact, are planning big expansion of bike trails and curtailing of traffic. I mean, when I think about time travel, I want to go back to where cities didn't have cars and experience that. I mean, the cars have taken the streets away from us.
Yeah, maybe that's a generational thing, but I can't think of a scenario where there's no cars on the road. But I was actually, when you talk about time travel, it's interesting. It's slightly different, but I watched Matt Damon's movie, The Martian, last weekend, actually. I've been trying to stay away from Contagion because it's a little bit too real to life at the moment. But his character in the movie, is trying to make food for himself. He has to find a water source for himself, also that he could stay alive on Mars. And it made me think a little bit about the biosphere and what lessons or how you learned how to keep that biosphere alive, and what that might mean in terms of successfully preparing for life on Mars one day.
I think when I was watching The Martian, and I read the book after seeing the movie, I was virtually in tears when his little closed system and his potatoes perished. And it was kind of like that in the biosphere. And we had some pests. We had to juggle crops, that worked well, etc. But we were like loving parents in that. And of course, we were on a calorie restricted diet. That's another story. The first group of humans intensively studied on a nutrient dense but restricted calorie diet, made our doctor really happy. He was a world expert and a pioneer in that field. It didn't make the rest of us happy. So we were determined to grow more food. And we grew 3 or 4 tons more food the second year. And I volunteered to go back in, and I wish I could go back into a biosphere now, because 20 more years of organic farming, I could do an even better job.
You'd be having a feast every Friday.
Every day, maybe.
Every day. But I think that was another question I'd want to ask you, but you kind of almost answered yourself. If you could go back in and I'm sure there's going to be demand for a Spaceship Earth II documentary potentially, but would you do it all over again? And what would you do differently now that you've had the first experience?
I absolutely would. And I discovered that I wasn't the only one who kind of quietly told Mission Control, if you need another crew member for the second crew, I'll go in. I and all the other biospherians frequently have dreams where we're back in Biosphere 2, or we're getting ready to step into Biosphere 3, 4, or 5.
Wow.
And let me just put out, my group is small, but we think big, which I think the movie really captures. And, so naming Biosphere 2 was one to underline the only biosphere that we have, and we're destructively testing it now, is our global biosphere. But, given the stakes of learning how to live with a biosphere, we were hoping, and I still hope, that there'll be Biosphere 3, 5, 10, 100. Every city should have a biosphere, both for research and public education and inspiration. Yeah, I always dreamed that, before a big G12 or whatever the number is now summit, that they put all the world leaders inside a biospheric system. Make them grow some food and wander around and enjoy the beauty of whichever biomes are in that particular one, and then let them, like you're saying, we have things reversed. Then let them decide whether we feel affluent enough to take care of the environment. I think it would totally change. And by the way, we had the great fun of putting some journalists inside the test module. We had one of the radio stars. We had one of the radio stars of Mexico City who actually broadcast his show live to Mexico from our Biosphere 2 test module.
Oh my gosh, what an idea, putting all the world leaders into a biosphere before a climate summit.
I know, then they might also understand. They would also understand how much they have in common, that they all need clean air, clean water, clean food. They wouldn't want to live in a devastated industrial zone.
No, absolutely not. So, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You really are a fascinating person, and you've had many unique experiences. For anyone who would like to learn more about Mark's experience on Biosphere 2, I would highly recommend watching Spaceship Earth or taking some time to read his books, Life Under Glass, Crucial Lessons in Planetary Stewardship from 2 years in the Biosphere 2, and his book, The Wastewater Gardener. Thank you very much, Mark, for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.